Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Environmental Health Australia's live chat event to celebrate World Mosquito Day 2021. In 1894, Ronald Ross, a medical officer in the Indian Medical Service, studied mosquitoes as the likely vector of the malaria parasite. After years of fruitless research, Ross finally proved in 1897 that Anopheles mosquitoes could carry the malaria parasite. He called the day of his discovery, the 20th of August, 1897, Mosquito Day. And that's why we're here today. Now, World Mosquito Day is about raising awareness around the importance of mosquitoes and vector control in our communities, and certainly the issues in relation to human health. It's interesting to note that World Health Organization figures indicate that there are about 230 million cases of malaria each year. And malaria is just one mosquito-borne disease. And of those 230 million cases, around about 230,000 people die on best estimates. It's interesting to compare that with our current world crisis in a pandemic. There are about 210 million cases at the moment of COVID have been recorded around the world. It's fair to say that the death rate is a lot worse, with about 4.4 million people. But today we'll be hearing from three mosquito experts who will discuss mosquitoes in our current and future climate and how they can affect public health. And it's worth reflecting on those sorts of figures. To ask a speaker a question, simply type a comment. You're welcome to comment at any time, and questions will be answered at the end of speaker presentations. Our first speaker joining us is Eloise Skinner. Following her initial scientific research on climate change and global food security, Eloise went on to complete a PhD in vector-borne disease epidemiology at Griffith University. Today, Eloise works as a postdoctoral research fellow at Stanford University, specializing in the ecology of infectious disease and in particular, understanding how climate, species, interactions and global change drive infectious disease dynamics in humans and natural ecosystems. Welcome, Eloise.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Phil. Alrighty, I'll jump straight into it. So I'm guessing everyone can see my screen. Here we go. So as you heard, my name's Dr. Eloise Skinner, and today I want to talk to you about a couple of different topics: climate change, mosquitoes, and hosts here in Australia. If you want to follow my updates or contact me at all, feel free to jump onto my Twitter or send me an email at any time. So this is a few different topics to cover. So I want to say, take a journey with me through different scales. Let's start at the smallest scale that we've got here, the mosquitoes. So these are three things that I would like you to know about mosquitoes, and they're definitely not the only three things there are to know about mosquitoes. The first thing is that mosquitoes are highly dependent on their external environment. So not only do mosquitoes have a terrestrial and an aquatic life stage, so they need to have both of those habitats available to actually survive. Mosquitoes are ectotherms. So we as people are endotherms. That means that we regulate our own body temperature. Whereas mosquitoes and reptiles, they're ectotherms. So they're dependent on the external temperature to regulate all sorts of life history traits. Temperature can change the number of eggs a mosquito lays, the amount of time it takes for a mosquito to do a full life cycle. It can change the biting patterns of mosquitoes and also their adult survival rate. So their environment really dictates their life stages and their entire survival. The second thing I want you to know is that mosquitoes are really diverse. So a lot of people think that mosquitoes are this single insect that fly through the air, ready to infect you with diseases. And it's not quite the case. In fact, there are many, many different species of mosquitoes. They come in all sorts of different shapes, sizes, colors. In the world, it's estimated that there's more than 3,000 species of mosquitoes, so it's quite a diverse taxa. And here in Australia, we have over 300 species. They don't only differ in how they look, but they also differ in their ecology. So we might have species that are dependent on freshwater, saltwater, or container breeders to actually persist. We might have some species that are really dominant in urban environments, while other species dominant in rural environments. They're really quite a diverse taxa, and it's not just that one insect. I guess kind of building onto this, it leads into the third point that I want you to know, and that's not all species of mosquitoes require a blood meal. Many of them act as pollinators and they are dependent on nectar to survive. But those that do require a blood meal, again, if something's biting you, it's only going to be a female mosquito, not the males. And that's because they require blood and the nutrients to lay eggs. But even then, if a female mosquito is biting you, it might not be a disease vector. There's an entire criteria that mosquitoes have to go through to be considered a vector of disease. All right, we're going to jump to the next scale, and that is mosquitoes and their hosts. So what I want you to know about mosquito-borne diseases is that they're actually, the large majority of them are zoonotic. And that means the mosquito has to bite an infected animal before it bites a person. Mosquitoes might only live for about 30 days, and so they have to really bite an infected animal early on in the piece. If we just take an aside, I really like that Phil gave a good introduction to mosquito-borne diseases. And just putting that into context, vector-borne diseases account for about 17% of the global burden of all infectious diseases. It's actually quite a large chunk of the pie. More than half of the world is at threat of getting an infectious disease from a mosquito. And dengue virus alone is responsible for 400 million infections annually. And as we just heard, COVID at the moment has hit about 210 million cases. So dengue virus almost doubles that every single year. Here in Australia, we don't necessarily have diseases that will cause mortality, but Ross River virus, our most common mosquito-borne disease, has a significant public health and economic burden. It often makes our news headlines, and people that have had Ross River virus really do suffer. Managing zoonotic diseases, though, it's really quite a challenge. So you really have to have a good understanding of how the environment interacts with the animals and the humans and mosquitoes jumping between each of those. And this is quite difficult to have all of those parameters. But again, as we heard, it's not necessarily a new challenge. So this here on the right is a map of malaria in the US in the 1870. And as we just heard, models for malaria transmission date back more than 120 years, making it one of the first human diseases subject to mathematical inquiry. So while it's really complicated to understand zoonotic diseases, we do actually have the tools to do it. All right, now we're going to jump to the next scale. We're going even bigger, and I'm going as big as we can go. We're going to go global now. So just very briefly, I just want to touch on climate change and what that might look like for mosquito-borne diseases. This is a paper that came out in 2012 that said, a warmer world is a sicker world. Where we currently see, just focusing still on malaria, the burden of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, it was estimated that by 2041 to 2050, which really isn't that far away, we'll see 400 times more the infectious malaria bites per person. But as I mentioned earlier, mosquitoes are ectotherms. And like any ectotherm, their performance, whatever that trait might be, survival, biting, egg laying, increases with temperature, but it only increases to an optimal temperature. Beyond that, it gets too hot and performance completely declines. So survival might increase to a certain point, and then mosquitoes and their pathogens can't survive at an upper temperature. That result that I just showed you assumed a linear response, which only continued going up and up and up with temperature. So taking into account a non-linear idea of mosquito-borne diseases, we actually found that malaria has an optimal transmission at about 25 degrees Celsius, which when you compare to the sort of linear trend where warmer is sicker, it was 7 degrees cooler than the previous trend. We've been able to do this now for 13 different mosquito-borne diseases, including Ross River virus here in Australia, which is kind of one of the lighter orangey colours. But essentially you can see that some diseases might peak around 25, while other diseases might peak around 29 or 30 degrees Celsius. And so in light of climate change, what that suggests is where we see the largest burden of malaria right now is currently at that 25 degrees Celsius optimal transmission. Under a warming world, we'll actually see a reduced burden of malaria in Africa. But we're not necessarily in the clear because other diseases like dengue, which have an optimal suitability for 29 degrees Celsius, might actually become a problem. So what we'll see is a shift from one disease to another, and we need to be considering in terms of health whether or not we're prepared to deal with the burden of dengue over malaria. But what about, again, back here, local diseases? Well, as I already mentioned, we might have a lot of things in Australia that can kill us, but mosquito-borne diseases are less likely to be that. We do have Ross River virus, which is the most common mosquito-borne disease in Australia. It's like no other pathogen in the world. We have it across every state and territory. Even in Tasmania, you can get Ross River virus. There are a lot of different species that can transmit Ross River virus. So we have over 30 species of mosquitoes that can transmit Ross River virus potentially. And in terms of animal hosts, there's at least 50 species that we found positive antibodies for, meaning that they experience natural infection. This is just a working hypothesis. This isn't something I've necessarily tested very well, but I would suspect that for something like Ross River virus, biodiversity is going to be more important than climate. And that's because we see the virus persisting across broad climates at the moment. But when you've got a highly diverse area, you might have a mosquito that can come through and bite animals that are not hosts, and they therefore act as decoys to human health. Whereas when you have less biodiversity, there could be a greater probability that a mosquito will bite an infected animal before biting a person. But we do have things like dengue and Aedes aegypti, and it's of course possible that that expansion could occur across Australia with a warmer climate. Or even other things at the moment, dengue's managed through a bacteria called Wolbachia, and Wolbachia will also have a thermal optima. So as it gets warmer, these sort of intervention measures may not be as effective, and these are things that we need to calculate and consider. All right, so my take-home points for you. Number one, I want you to remember, mosquitoes are highly diverse. They don't all transmit disease. They can still act as pollinators. And so trying to wipe mosquitoes out altogether is just not going to be possible. Number two, if you are thinking of climate change and mosquito-borne diseases, it's really important to think of them as a non-linear trend. There may be more diseases, but there may be fewer diseases as well, both globally and locally. And of course, despite these really complex transmission cycles, needing to know about animals, needing to know about the environment and human health, we do actually have the tools to predict and prepare for these changes. And of course, through research, we really hope that we can change headlines like this of scare on Ross River fever to rare Ross River fever. Right, so I'll leave it at that. If you've got any questions, or if you'd like to, again, follow me on my social media or send an email, you're more than welcome to.
Thanks very much, Eloise. I'm wondering if we've got any questions there. That's very informative. And I suppose the issues of climate change are something that is on the minds of everyone at the moment, particularly with the meeting coming up in the Northern Hemisphere shortly. I saw a paper a couple of years ago about genetic technologies that are being employed in relation to mosquitoes. So I'm just wondering, do you have any insights into that current research?
To be honest, that's not really my field of expertise. I know that there's a lot of research going on, but I guess in the context of something like climate change, mosquitoes will also have their own adaptations. And I guess anything that we do, we've got to consider whether or not they'll adapt to be more favorable to different climates, whether that's genetically or naturally, or whether they won't. So it's a whole, so much to do within genetic research as well. That's just a completely different ballgame for me.
Yeah, certainly. I'm probably putting you on the spot there. I understand there's been a lot of debate in Florida, I think it is, about a trial of genetic modification of mosquitoes. So it'd be interesting to see how that work goes.
Yeah, definitely. So I can see this question here. How easy is it to test mosquitoes to see what they feed on? And that's a really important question to ask because mosquito blood meals, they really tell us what the interaction is between mosquitoes and their environment. You can understand a bit more about disease transmission, but finding those little suckers is really difficult because as soon as a mosquito's taken a blood meal, the only thing it wants to do is go and rest and digest. So they don't actually fly into our traditional traps, which are CO2 baited so that mosquitoes are attracted to them. They might just go off and rest, and trying to catch them is very tedious, but so important if we can catch them. If anyone comes up with a method to catch blood feds, we'll all be very happy. Yes, so there are so of course, when we think of climate change, we often think firstly of temperature, but there's going to be shifts in other extreme events too, like wet weather, droughts, precipitation, and precipitation and droughts have really different effects again on mosquitoes. So for example, they need a water source to be able to breed, and that means rain might be good, but too much rain can actually flush out their breeding habitats as well. Or in drought situations, they don't have the water, but people might be storing water in rainwater tanks or other containers around their house that can promote breeding as well. So again, it's one of those things that it's not a linear trend where more rain means more mosquitoes and more drought means fewer mosquitoes. It can actually go either way depending on the species. So do you reckon with climate change, Australia will meet new mosquito-borne challenges? I do think we can meet new mosquito-borne challenges as they come up. And I think that we've got the tools here in Australia and we've got the interest to try and do that as well. It's just like, for example, the Wolbachia and dengue in northern Australia at the moment has been really groundbreaking stuff, and just trying to make sure we're prepared for any climate change in that as well will be really important. Thanks for the question.
Okay. Says there's no further questions, Eloise. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was excellent. And we really appreciate your time.
Nice. The invitation.
And of course, you're welcome to stay on and hear our next speaker. So now we'll be speaking with Craig Williams, the Dean of Programs at the University of South Australia. As well as being an academic at the University of South Australia, researching environmental and public health, Craig also teaches courses in human ecology and global health. Thank you for joining us today, Craig. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure, and I hope and trust that you can see me and my slides, and it's all good. So, look, I just want to speak to you all just for a little bit about citizen science and mosquito surveillance. So Elle, really clearly actually set this all up beautifully about, the importance of mosquitoes ecologically and their role in disease transmission and the great variety of mosquitoes that's out there. Surveillance, as we know, in all aspects of environmental health, is one of the sort of the foundation stones upon which health management is based. We need good surveillance of disease, of anything to do with health, and mosquitoes are no different. So we have to have robust mosquito surveillance systems to help us address any public health threats from mosquitoes. This work, just a quick shout out to some of my collaborators. I have a PhD student, marvelous student, Larissa Braz-Sousa. She's from Brazil, and she's been doing a lot of this work for her PhD around citizen science and mosquito surveillance. Cameron Webb, you'll hear from very shortly in this session. That's that fellow with the beard on the right and a very large mosquito in front of him. And Steve, pictured in the middle here, is our main sort of field operatives and mosquito identifiers. Citizen science, most people would have heard of citizen science now, and it's becoming increasingly used in scientific endeavours, not only to gather information which is useful for scientists, but also to engage the public. We're actually doing some other research in our group around the actual health benefits of participating in citizen science. And so, and look, this image is not people, identifying mosquitoes with binoculars. That would be a very large mosquito, but actually, old images sort of showing about 100 years ago some of the origins of major citizen science initiatives, particularly with bird counts and the famous Christmas bird counts that have happened. So, so people have, we're not the first ones to link citizen science and mosquito surveillance together. In fact, there are a bunch of mosquito surveillance projects which involve the general public worldwide, particularly in Europe, which is a bit of a hotbed for this sort of, liberal progressive thinking. One of the reasons Europe is such a sort of a place for citizen science mosquito surveillance is they've had the invasion of many European countries, particularly the warmer Mediterranean countries, with the Asian tiger mosquito, which is a vector of dengue, which Elle was talking about before. And so this has sort of stimulated projects in Spain, the Mosquito Alert Project there, Myconatlas in Germany, and then other projects in Italy and the Netherlands and so forth, where they've actually harnessed people power to try and track these exotic mosquitoes and find out where they are. A lot of these projects have involved the development of mobile phone apps, smartphone apps, where people have been able to photograph mosquitoes, upload those photographs to an app, and then they've been able to track where exotic mosquitoes may be. Our little project in Australia is called Monitors, the central one there, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that and its origins. But it's worth me just pointing out that indeed we're not even the first people in Australia to do citizen science mosquito surveillance. There's a project in southeast Queensland called Zika Mozzie Seeker, which some people may have heard out of Queensland Health, where they've been engaging the public to collect mosquito eggs, and then they process those eggs to see whether any of these are invasive Asian tiger mosquitoes. But our Mozzie Monitors project began, probably 3.5 years ago now, and it involves giving people a mosquito trap. One pictured here, it's actually a black bucket with some modifications, and it's got water in it, and it's called a BG Gat trap. And we package this up in a box with some instructions, and it's got no moving parts. You can just put water in it and a couple other bits and pieces, and you can collect mosquitoes. And so we combined this. There's quite a simple trap. We didn't invent the trap. It was designed by folks at James Cook University. And we send people these traps, and we send them instructions and engage with them via social media and email and so forth, and trigger them to set the trap at their house and tip it out every couple of weeks and take a photograph of the mosquitoes with their smartphone. And then we get them to email us the photos, and we identify the mosquitoes from the photos. So we never see the mosquitoes ourselves. So previously, when we've done mosquito trapping, I've done a lot of that over 25 years. You go and set a trap and collect the mosquitoes the next day, and then you count the mosquitoes and identify them with a microscope. We've been branching out into e-entomology, so electronicology, where we just look at the photos on the screen, identify the mozzies, and then we report the results back to people. And that's kind of the foundation of what we call Mozzie Monitors. We've been doing some projects in the top of Western Australia and in South Australia, but this year we branched out to Mozzie Month. And we wanted to see if we can run a national program. So it's the first time we've done this. And it was a long month, a 6-week month. And it was started in March this year. And we recruited over 100 people from 5 states and territories. And we, mailed them their traps. And we said, right, okay, everyone, for this Mozzie month, we're going to get you to set the trap 3 times, tip out the mozzies, and then we will we'll look at the photographs you send, and we'll collate a report. And look, it worked out pretty well. It turns out you can recruit people via social media and other professional and social networks. You can send them a mosquito trap, and they'll actually, take photos of mosquitoes that they collect. And you might be able to see on the screen here this little blue image. That's the kind of thing you get when people tip out the mozzies after a couple of weeks and onto a card that we give them, and then we can identify them from the photograph. And so we've got over 1,000 mosquitoes collected by members of the public around Australia doing this thing. So I suppose one of our principal questions to ask was, can you do this nationally? But beyond that, we're trying to answer a number of other questions about what motivates people to participate. Do we actually get good public health and environmental health information? What sort of mosquitoes do we get? Do we get variation between sites and so forth? And we are digging into the data to explore these aspects. In short, though, we do tend to get common mosquito species that are in and around people's homes. And this gives us a very direct read of the species kind of bother people in their homes, particularly in urban areas. So this little one on the left, Aedes nodoscriptus, a really common urban, mosquito around people, and this one, Culex quincafasciatus, or quinks, which is another very common one. But you do get other more interesting ones like Toxorynchides here. One of the hallmarks of citizen science is that it's quite low cost, and so you can get very large coverage for us, 5 different states and territories at quite minimal cost. Mozzie Monitors also has another aspect, and that is through what's called iNaturalist. iNaturalist is a web-based and mobile phone app-based naturalist program where people who like nature take photographs of plants and animals and whatever, post it on iNaturalist, and through a combination of artificial intelligence and other people in the program, they identify the specimens. Steve from our group started up a Mozzie Monitors project in iNaturalist. This spawned similar projects in Brazil, Mozzie Monitors Brazil, and although it's in Portuguese, so it's not quite called that, and Mozzie Monitors Southern Africa. So lots of people can participate in Mozzie Monitors through the iNaturalist app and just photograph stuff they like. Cameron Webb, who you're about to hear from, is one of the to this. But one of the exciting things is you can actually find, make some very unexpected findings in this way. And so this is still being worked through, but it does appear that through this iNaturalist app, a mosquito not known to be in Australia before, only previously known from Papua New Guinea, was actually detected and lodged through the iNaturalist Mozzie Monitors project, sort of really demonstrating the power of a citizen science approach. And so, look, there's lots of things for us still to ask, questions for us to answer in how citizen science works. How does it articulate with public and environmental health properly? Lots of questions we're trying to answer, and myself and my colleagues are really happily trying to do that. So that's about all I've got to say at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, not many people have the millions of dollars.
Thanks very much. Great. Thanks for the presentation, and certainly it raises some interesting issues about value for money with science and research, doesn't it?
Yeah. When we do the costings, it's I mean, you get different data with citizen science, so it doesn't have the same you know, there's not the same sort of reliability and sort of regularity of it, but it's broad. It's got a very broad scope.
All right, I think we've seen a question up there.
Yeah, thanks, John. So you do get a large number of unidentifiable specimens, and that rate varies, but roughly about 70% identifiable. It's roughly about 7 in 10. Thanks, John. Yeah, great question from Peter there. Sure, photo quality. You can encourage people and give them tips and tricks around taking photographs. Smartphone cameras are becoming increasingly good, and we provide a tip card, a laminated card, and we did some previous research and worked out a great background color, which really helps. So we use like a blue background, which actually gives us the best definition on the images. So through a uniform tip card and some tips and tricks, that helps. But with citizen science, you get all kinds of stuff, all kinds of quality. You get everything in between. So it's quite variable. And thanks, Jacinta. Yeah, absolutely. Citizen science data available. Yeah, that's the idea, that it should be publicly sourced and publicly available. So on mozziemonitors.com, we do have our sort of public-facing sort of summary report available. So that's mozziemonitors.com. And we are producing a full technical report with like all of the data, all of the numbers, and that's also going to be on that website. But also we plan to publish that through other channels. But that we really firmly believe that publicly sourced data should be publicly available. So that's the plan. Thanks, Jacinta. Oh, yes. So Mozzie Monitors at unisa.edu.au. You can either email us or check out our mozziemonitors.com website, and we'd love to hear from you. We are planning to run Mozzie Month again in 2022, but of course, at any time you can get on the iNaturalist app and participate in the project. Yeah, we'd love Tasmanian to get involved in the next round of Mozzie Monitors. So I think probably best, I mean, feel free, you can just Google me and write to me, and I can set people up with email contacts, but we will keep like a register of people who express interest. So yeah, we'd love involved. I will send you a trap and make it happen.
All right, that looks like the end of the questions, Craig. They were coming thick and fast there for a couple of minutes. Thank you so much for the presentation, Craig, and all the best. And again, feel free to stay on and hear from our next speaker, which is, of course, Cameron Webb. So our final speaker is Professor Cameron Webb. Cameron is a medical entomologist with New South Wales Health Pathology and the University of Sydney. He has been researching mosquitoes and mosquito-borne disease for over 25 years. In addition to coordinating independent research projects and participating in interdisciplinary collaborative projects, he provides professional advice to local, state and federal governments, wetland management authorities, engineers, developers and private industry regarding mosquito-borne management strategies. He spends most of his summer in gumboots and frequently being bitten by mosquitoes. Well, hopefully not too frequently. Cameron, over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Phil, and hopefully everyone can see my slides and hear me. If not, let me know. Look, thanks to Craig and Elle for setting the scene for us on this World Mosquito Day, and they've outlined really nicely what the situation is, particularly in Australia, but also internationally, with regard to mosquito-borne disease and how we might go about chasing mosquitoes, tracking them, and better understanding how their populations change. In this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're changing our cities and how we can green our cities to try to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change, but at the same time, not necessarily make a new home for mosquitoes. As Elle pointed out, Australia has an incredibly diverse range of mosquitoes. We've got more than 300 different species of mosquitoes, and it's just diversity and ecological specificity that these mozzies have that I think has really attracted me to want to study them for such a long time. Every type of environment you can imagine in Australia, there's a mosquito that has adapted to it. From coastal rock pools right up to snowmelt pools in the alpine regions, pristine habitats, polluted habitats, and almost everything in between, especially those that are found in our own backyards and around our cities and suburbs. But mosquitoes not only can be a nuisance because they bite us, but they can also pose a health risk because of the pathogens they can transmit, particularly some of our local viruses like Ross River virus, and also some of the international viruses like dengue, chikungunya, and Zika virus that pose a threat to the health of Australians. And we've learned to live with mosquitoes every summer, but certainly there's a concern amongst authorities about how these pest and public health risks might be managed into the future. Now, before we go any further, I've got an admission to make, and that is that I actually quite like mosquitoes. They may be the deadliest animals on the planet, but they're also pretty fascinating and sometimes even quite beautiful. Scientists have been pretty good at working out how to kill mosquitoes, work out how they spread the pathogens that make us sick, but we're not really good at working out what their ecological role is. We know mosquitoes are food for birds and bats and fish and frogs and spiders. They also help pollinate some plants, but we are yet to find a plant or animal on the planet that is completely reliant on mosquitoes. But that doesn't mean that we can go ahead and eradicate mosquitoes from the planet. And I think that when we talk about managing mosquitoes, we have to give some consideration to their ecological role and what may be the consequence of eradicating them from some of our local environments. Perhaps the mozzies that live in our cities aren't so useful to the local environment, but certainly the mosquitoes that are found in our local wetlands could be important for some of our endangered animals. We need to keep that in mind. So, with climate change, how are mosquitoes going to respond? It makes sense that a warmer, wetter world might be better for mosquitoes, but mosquitoes are an incredibly complex animal, and there's a whole range of different species that will respond to a changing climate in lots of different ways. It's not just about a hotter planet, but it's also about a planet that's being impacted by more extreme weather events, things like floods or coastal flooding caused by sea level rise, but also changes in humidity. The change in the seasonal distribution of temperatures are going to be a really important role in driving changes in mosquito populations. And that's not just more mosquitoes, but it's also the diversity of mosquitoes. What types of mosquitoes are living in close proximity to people? They're the things that we need to consider when we're trying to weigh up the risks that might be associated with mosquito populations. But beyond the way the climate is changing, it's also human activity and the way that it changes our exposures to mosquitoes that we need to think about. And it may be the case that future mosquito-borne disease risk is determined as much by human activity in the way we change the environment as it is temperature, tides, and rainfall. Things like wildlife conservation, wetland rehabilitation, and urban developments are all looking at ways in which mosquitoes and people are brought together more frequently, and with them, those pest and public health risks. And this is particularly the case when we're thinking about greening our cities. We've heard a lot about the importance of increasing the vegetation cover, the plants in our cities to help provide shade and mitigate the impacts of heat waves. But if we want to green our cities, we also need water, and water is a perfect opportunity for mosquitoes to move in as well. But it's not just mosquitoes. As Elle explained in one of her earlier presentations, wildlife is really important as well. Mosquitoes don't hatch out of the wetlands necessarily carrying Ross River virus. They have to bite an animal first to pick that up. And that's the same for a lot of our homegrown viruses as well. And so when we think about the ways in which we change wetlands around our cities, we also have to think about the ways in which our wildlife are changing as well. And perhaps in the way we try to increase refuges for wildlife, perhaps we're inadvertently increasing the risks of mosquito-borne disease in our cities and suburbs. Water-sensitive urban design is a key element of urban developments in recent decades, and particularly in our cities. So for those of you who have been visiting a new residential estate or urban development in any of the major cities around the country, you'll see an increasing number of wetlands, bioretention swales and basins, and also the incorporation of rainwater tanks into residential properties and other facilities around these parklands. A lot of the time I spend every summer is assessing these types of wetlands to see whether they're creating opportunities for mosquitoes. Because in many cases, this stormwater infrastructure is going into an area where existing mosquito populations don't necessarily already exist. Particularly freshwater wetlands in our urban developments, because not only are these a key element of water-sensitive urban design, but they're often incorporated into providing passive and active recreational areas. There's often playgrounds, boardwalks, cycleways that run in and crisscross these wetlands, and so you can only imagine that the mosquitoes produced from these wetlands are going to impact people who are living nearby. There's a whole suite of design features that you can incorporate into wetlands that help reduce the amount of mosquitoes that are coming out of these wetlands. And they'll be unique to certain situations. But unfortunately, sometimes these considerations aren't always reviewed before these wetlands are constructed. That means there can be challenges with maintenance. That means that even though the wetlands don't create a mosquito problem initially, over time they can become more conducive for mosquitoes. Some of the work done by my PhD student, Jane Hannaford, has shown that one of the other key elements of these constructed wetlands is that if you can create habitats that are ecologically healthy, there's lots of other aquatic organisms that are in the water, it actually helps suppress the populations of mosquitoes. If you can create an opportunity for predators of mosquitoes, you're going to dramatically reduce the number of mosquitoes that are going to be found in these wetlands. But we also need to think about not just the wetlands we're creating within the urban development, but also the wetlands nearby. There's increasing demand for urban developments to kind of be constructed right close to existing wetlands. And this can really create a problem for the community's exposure to mosquitoes. We can't do mosquito control everywhere, and so we need to think about ways in which we can create a buffer between mosquito habitats and the people who are moving into the new area. Local councils in New South Wales are using development control plans to help guide urban development, not just about the construction of wetlands and stormwater management, but actually where we're putting the people. That can kind of greatly reduce their exposure to mosquitoes. But most importantly of all, when we're trying to live with mosquitoes in a local area, particularly an area where there is endemic mosquito-borne disease, it's important that there's a strong message sent to the community that mosquitoes are a health concern and people must take measures to avoid mosquito bites. And we can't go about controlling mosquitoes the way we used to in the past. We know the use of insecticides can have not only an adverse impact on the local environment, but also drive the development of insecticide resistance in a lot of mosquito populations. And that's a threat to Australia because for those mosquitoes found overseas, if they make their way to Australia and they're resistant to commonly used insecticides, it'll be more difficult to eradicate them from our local cities and suburbs. Many authorities around Australia really have a more ecologically sustainable approach to mosquito management. We use insect growth regulators or bacterial-based products that can be applied to wetlands that are highly specific to mosquitoes. And these programs are really designed to knock the peaks off the really high abundances of mosquitoes, not necessarily eradicate them. So authorities around Australia have been able to sort of integrate environmental management with mosquito management quite successfully in many areas. But it's how we manage these mosquitoes and water in our cities that is really going to set the scene for possibly the spread and introduction of these mosquitoes that might transmit some of the more serious disease-causing pathogens like dengue, Zika, or chikungunya virus. And that's why we need to be mindful about the ways we manage water, both in rainwater tanks and other infrastructure around our cities. And particularly in New South Wales, we're trying to build capacity amongst our environmental health professionals to try to better be able to survey environments and even respond to the introduction of some of these exotic mosquitoes into our suburbs. It's been a really great initiative authorities in New South Wales have been pursuing in recent years, and I've been happy to be part of it. So in summary, we certainly can green our cities, and that doesn't mean that we're going to increase mosquito populations. But we really need to be mindful of mosquitoes and take into account that there's a range of habitats that might be created when we green our cities. And if we take a collaborative and integrated approach to managing mosquitoes, hopefully we can have our greenery without the mosquito bites each summer. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you can fire through online. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cameron. Thanks for your presentation. Very informative. And I know that, yes, I've certainly seen some changes in my time in the environmental health area with particularly the things you're referring to, greening of cities, swales, those sort of things with water-sensitive urban design. In fact, I recall this subject being raised about concern about reed-breeding mosquitoes in Perth back in the sort of mid-90s. So thanks again very much for your presentation. I think we've got some questions coming through. You able to see that one there? What role can environmental health officers play in helping reduce mosquito impacts as we green our cities?
Yeah, I think it's really important that environmental health officers who have great experience with working with the local community really are sort of frontline troops in terms of assisting with the education of the community about reducing the opportunities for mosquitoes to be breeding around their backyards. So things like tipping out those water holding containers that are a great source of mosquitoes, but also helping other aspects of local council, things like considering development control plans, and also working closely with those parts of council that are working with stormwater management and also in natural resources, so that mosquitoes are something that everybody's thinking about when they're managing the local environment and those broad range of environmental health risks. So Phil, I can see a question that's come in here about the COVID outbreak and how that's impacted the way we manage mosquitoes in Australia. And I think this is something here in New South Wales we're thinking about when we've still got elevated numbers of COVID cases, but quickly approaching the next mosquito season. And it certainly is important that there's a lot of other competing public health priorities at the moment. But we know that mosquitoes aren't really concerned about COVID. And so things like Ross River virus will continue to be a concern over the summer. And with more people sort of social distancing, perhaps working from home, exercising around their local bushland and parklands, they may be actually more likely to be exposed to mosquito bites and mosquito-borne disease. So it's important when we're talking to our community to make sure they're putting on mosquito repellent when they're going outside as we start to approach mosquito season. I see that there's some questions here about environmental health professionals working with defence, and I think that there's a long history of some really wonderful medical entomology research, particularly in relation to mosquitoes and mosquito-borne disease management that our colleagues in the defence forces have been able to do. And I think their experience, particularly overseas, dealing in areas where there's malaria and dengue, can be used to inform some of the approaches that we might use to manage mozzies here in Australia.
Another one there, Cameron. I think probably touched
on
that.
So there's a question here about what's the best way to reduce mosquitoes in our backyards during the summer. So I think it's really important that we spend some time now in late winter, early spring, get into the backyard, see where all those water holding containers are, and make sure we tip them out, cover them up, and just reduce the volume of habitats that might be in our backyard where it'll trap water and will provide habitat for mosquitoes. Make sure your rainwater tank is screened, your gutters and drains around the backyard are cleared out of leaf litter and other junk, because whenever you trap water anywhere, even in the smallest of volumes in the backyard, that'll be a great place for mosquitoes to move in.
That looks like the end of the questions, Cameron. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for joining us today. It's much appreciated.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
That concludes our World Mosquito Day live chat this year. I hope everyone enjoyed this event as much as I did, and maybe even learned something new. I want to take this opportunity to again thank all of our fantastic speakers for taking the time to be part of today's live chat and sharing their knowledge and experience with everyone. And our communications officer, Sam, goes to a great deal of effort to get interesting speakers in for these live chats, and is doing a great job. A recording of this chat will be made available via the EHA YouTube channel in the coming week, so keep an eye on the EHA social media channels. We've just shared a link to the EHA YouTube page in the comments. I think that's there. And lastly, if you'd like more information on environmental health, EHOs or EHA, visit the Environmental Health Australia website. We've just upgraded all our websites for the associations and the national organisation. So please feel free to jump on and have a look. And thank you for joining us, everyone, and have a great Mosquito Day, perhaps Mosquito Control Day as EHOs. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day.